Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to start the second day of the workshop on new developmentalism. I'm going to read the disclaimer of Getulio Vargas Foundation. So the statement is expressed by Fundação Getulio Vargas employees and guests who take part in online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here spontaneously agreed to participate in this event and to authorize the use of their name, voice, and image, besides assigning the copyrights related to their exhibition for this broadcast, which will be available later on FGV's official channel. Before passing the floor to our keynote speaker, Robert Wade, I want to make some greetings for, I want to thank you, GCON, and also the people of the event and the name of Belisa. Thank you very much. I want to thank you, the Young Scholar Initiative, that really helped us organizing and financing the event. So I want to thank you, Juliano, here, and also Gabriel. Yesterday, I forgot to say where you can find more about Young Scholar Initiative, so you can go in the Google and put ysi.ineteconomics.org. And there you can find all the projects that you can enroll in and how you can participate more in this network that is very, very important for pluralist economics. And now we're going to have the second keynote speech of Robert Wade. Thank you very much, Robert. I also want to say to the public watching in YouTube that you can send questions. There's a link in the description of the video. Yesterday we had 432 people watching online. So I think it would be nice also for people online to participate.
Okay, well, thanks again for the invitation. Yesterday I talked about the challenge by a coalition of major developing countries to the rulemaking of Western countries. And I want to leave you with one thought about that, which is that the WTO building, so the building in which is housed the world's very important multilateral trade negotiation organization, the WTO building is named for an icon of the neoliberal, distinctly neoliberal, not neoclassical, neoliberal movement, and that is William Rappard. I was just completely astonished when I stood in front of this building and I saw that his name was in big gold letters on both of the entrance columns. And it is a very striking point that the main organization, the main global organization for formulating rules of international trade is named for this icon of the neoliberal movement. It's a point, I think, that's not widely enough known. Okay, so today I want to talk about China's challenge. And I want to dedicate this talk to Antonio Castro and Ana Jaguariba, is that right? Jaguariba, yes, exactly. Now, some of you who are Paulistas might not know these names because they are Carioca. And I have understood that there is a real kind of, let's say, difference in tribes between Paulistas and Carioca. But these two people were very prominent in Brazil-China relations. Antonio died quite a few years ago, but Ana died just quite recently, so this is for them. Okay, so let me begin with a very all too current event, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This invasion has prompted much talk of a coming Third World War, a very hot Third World War. But it looks more like a return to the old Cold War between the US and plus the West and the Soviet Union and China until about 1980 when it split from the Soviet Union. So for 4 decades, this is an important point to remember, the Cold War, the first Cold War went on for 4 decades. This is not a short-term event. And it might be that the new Cold War goes on also for several decades. It was called a Cold War because the leaders did not fight directly. They fought proxy, hot wars, like Korea, like Vietnam, now Ukraine. And they supported dictators, they supported insurgents, but they didn't fight directly. And global peace was maintained because both sides knew that they were subject to MAD, that is to say, mutual assured destruction at the hands of the nuclear weapons on the other side. Let me just mention that Russia is being very strongly criticized for invading a sovereign country. And I think it's worth remembering that these people here, or rather the men in this photo, all led the US in attacking sovereign states. It's striking that the US has not faced sanctions like Russia has faced the most draconian sanctions ever imposed on any nation. That's by way of passing. So the new Cold War can be seen as the second stage of a single conflict with a 30-year globalization intermission. And so I want to just spell out the similarities between the first and the second Cold War. Today, the US is again leading a Western alliance against a Russia-China axis, now, of course, with China dominant. Secondly, both sides are again avoiding direct fighting for fear of MAD. And both sides are again courting the bloc of non-aligned states, that is the Global South. So from the point of view of states in the Global South, there's a delicate diplomatic game as to how to play this new Cold War. But there are important differences with the first Cold War. First of all, China is mounting a much stronger challenge to US broad-spectrum hegemony than Russia or the Soviet Union ever did. For example, China is the biggest trading partner of almost every country in Asia. And the US government sees the China-Russia alliance as mounting a direct challenge, not just to the US and the West, but to the whole rule-based global order which the US and the West have constructed. This very strong challenge from China has led to talk of the Thucydides trap, that is the tendency for hot war to break out between an insurgent country challenging a hegemonic country. This is Thucydides in 400 or so BC, talking about the war between Sparta and Athens. Athens was challenging Sparta, and Thucydides said that there is a tendency for hot war to break out between challenging countries and incumbent superpowers. So there's talk now of the Third World War coming out of this challenge. So that was the first difference. Second difference, the first Cold War was focused on military and space between two basically different types of economy, between which there was little interdependence. But the second Cold War is between two variants of the same type, namely capitalism, and they are deeply interdependent. And the Cold War, focuses on these economic interdependencies. So each side is weaponizing. This is a great new word, fairly recently coined new word, weaponizing, the ability to control the supply of goods and services to the other, and also weaponizing the ability to disrupt others' digital networks, for example, via hacking, and that is to say, cyber war. So what we can now call MAD 1, that is mutually assured destruction, is joined now by MAD 2, mutual assured disruption. First of all, destruction, secondly, disruption, but the disruption is constrained by MAD 3, which is mutual assured dependence. Now coming on to the third difference. The Second Cold War is occurring in a situation of much more global upheaval and tension than the First Cold War. Climate chaos, artificial intelligence, pandemics, the threat of major war, mass migration, soaring economic insecurity and inequality, political polarization or fragmentation across Western polities, and so on. And in particular, important here, a general weakness of international solidarity in acting for the global collective good. And this weakness was dramatically exposed by the way that the rich countries hogged COVID-19 vaccines, and secondly, by the failure of G20 proposals for debt relief for developing countries, such as, for example, Sri Lanka. All this illustrates a general weakness of international solidarity. The US response to China's challenge and China's counter-response. Biden says the US, this is a recent statement, the US will not stand by and let China win the 21st century. The US has led the formation of a 4-nation Quad group specifically to counter Beijing, and that Quad group includes the US, Japan, Australia, and India. So far, it's had almost no impact. It's striking that there are no countries in this Quad from Southeast Asia. And the only country from Northeast Asia is Japan. And then again, another US response to China. Obama proposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been the largest trade bloc ever, and it was designed explicitly to exclude China. The rules of membership were made so that China could not join, without, of course, specifying China. And then Trump withdrew from that. Meanwhile, China has led the formation of an alternative called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And in 2021, China also applied to join the successor of the TPP. The US is out of both. That is, the US has not joined the successor to the TPP, and it's not joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Instead, the US has created what it calls the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The only problem with this is that other countries are quite uninterested in joining, especially because the US, in the rules for this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the US has not allowed improved access to the US market by members of this new coalition. So there's not much buy-in from developing countries for this. The two biggest open questions then are, first of all, will the current Cold War tip into the hot war, into the Third World War? And there is certainly a real risk of nuclear escalation, as there was not in the First World War, the First Cold War, because now we have tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear weapons, which were not in existence in the First Cold War. And so there's the possibility of an escalation ladder using nuclear weapons. And that, I think, raises the possibility of it becoming a nuclear hot war. But the second question that I want to concentrate on, can the deep economic integration between China, Russia, and the West survive the intensification of these superpower rivalries? And I quote Pierre Olive Gorinchas, who is the IMF chief economist, expressing a doubt that the deep integration could persist. He warns of the world splitting into distinct blocks with different ideologies, different political systems, technology standards, cross-border payments and trade systems, and reserve currencies. He warns of this danger. So the bottom line then is expressed by this statement, this succinct statement by a Finnish general: geopolitics is back, but it's in the economy. One particular manifestation of this is the fact that retired military officers who earlier, during the post-First Cold War globalization era, when the world economy operated on Western rules with little challenge, these retired military officers might have retired to a quiet life on the golf course, but they're now being employed by multinational corporations to advise them on how geopolitics is now affecting the economy. So I want to just run over some fronts in this new Cold War: trade, capital markets, high tech. It would be good to talk about digital technical standards as a front in the new Cold War, but I'm going to avoid that. It's too complicated. Also, I want to talk about cyber war and propaganda war. So beginning with the trade war, from China's perspective, the US has long tried to exclude China from rulemaking in international trade policy in order to defend the US's dominant role in the global trade regime. And remember what I said, the WTO building where these trade negotiations go on is named for an icon of the neoliberal movement. And of course, China is not going to be very happy about participating in such an atmosphere. So the US led the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which were aimed to set rules for global trade while excluding China. And the trade tensions between Western countries and China, plus the other BRICS, brought the WTO Doha round to a standstill, as I explained in the talk yesterday. And then Trump raised the pre-2017 average tariff on goods from China from about 3% to 20%. That's the average tariff on Chinese imports. And then China, in reply, raised its average tariff on goods from the US from 8% to 20%. And then the US has also imposed export controls on items close to what it calls national security. And so all this is captured in the New York Times headline from earlier this month. Export bans are central to the US plan to foil China. It's a dramatic headline. Export bans are central to the US plan to foil China. And this is a good example of what we mean by weaponizing trade. And then on the other hand, China uses trade controls as a weapon to punish states for offending Beijing, such as punishing Lithuania for allowing Taiwan to establish a Taiwan embassy in the capital city of Lithuania. And China has imposed drastic trade controls on Lithuania, but not just on Lithuania. China has banned the import of any goods made anywhere in the world which contain components made in Lithuania. That's how strict China has been. And Australia also has come under very strong criticism from, not just criticism from Beijing. Beijing has imposed import controls and very high tariffs on certain exports from Australia because the Australian government called for an independent international investigation into the origin of the COVID virus. And China was so angry at Australia for making that proposal that it weaponized trade in order to punish Australia. But remember, in all this talk about trade war, we are not yet in the era of deglobalization. If anything, slowbalization, yes, another new word. And you can see this. This is global merchandise trade as a share of GDP going back to 1820s. And basically, the point to see is that we are still at a very high level of merchandise trade to GDP relative to the past. It hasn't fallen much. So that's the trade war. Now the capital Cold War. The Chinese government is curbing foreign, especially US investor influence in China's capital market as part of China's strategy of moving from the assembly center of the world to the high-tech powerhouse. And the reasons for this move from assembly center to high-tech powerhouse are not just to do with economics and economic growth and so on, but also to do with national defense. And so the government shuts out foreign investors from Chinese IPOs. It blocks Chinese companies from listing in New York or London, and it signals that it can be dangerous for Chinese investors to invest in activities not on the government's menu. This is an expression of the broad Chinese strategy of imparting a strategic direction to the market. Strategic direction to the market. That's a phrase that is almost unknown in Anglo circles. Strategic direction to the market. But the Chinese government is extremely active in imparting strategic direction to the market, as in this case. And then the US government, on its part, is preventing or strongly discouraging US investment in China's strategic emerging industries. One US investor commented, "To be investing in China is now considered almost immoral." Almost immoral. So let me go on now and elaborate on the high-tech Cold War. In 2015, Beijing published Made in China 2025, so the next 10 years following 2015. This was a strategic plan to give China a commanding position in high-tech of the fourth industrial revolution, a commanding position in semiconductors, in artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, 5G, robotics, Internet of Things, biotech, green energy, and so on, using as a key instrument for pushing these activities concessional credit, establishing enormous concessional credits, dedicated funds for promoting these high-tech activities. And this, as I just said, is part of a general strategy to transform China from the world's factory to the tech powerhouse. And so for the US response, the US called Made in China 2025 economic aggression. Economic aggression. This is, again, the idea of weaponizing. Trump and Biden have raised tariffs on manufactured goods, including those especially on those included in Made in China 2025. The EU has also expressed alarm about Made in China 2025. The US is looking for ways to exploit China's dependence on semiconductors. So it places export controls on US semiconductor technology to China as one example of how the US is trying to exploit China's dependence on semiconductors. So a bit more on semiconductors. Semiconductors are the 21st century version of oil. I mean, they are the fundamental input now. But 80% of global chip production is in Asia. And in fact, almost all advanced chips are made in Taiwan by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC. And Beijing's aggression towards Taiwan threatens the production of these advanced chips. it's really quite remarkable that this little island off the coast of China with a population of, 25 million or so, supports the most advanced semiconductor industry in the world. The US and Europe are finally waking up, and they are beginning to give large subsidies for companies to localize chip production in their territory. For example, the US recently passed what it calls the CHIPS Act, which makes $52 billion available for chip production in the US. But China is estimated to be giving 3 times this amount in support of chip production in China. And just continuing on in this contrast between high tech in China and the US, here's an amazing example of high-speed trains. So China has 35,000 kilometers of high-speed track, which is 2/3 of the global total. The US has 735 kilometers against China's 35,000. The distance from Shanghai to Beijing is about equal to New York to Chicago. The Amtrak trains, New York to Chicago, normally take 24 hours, but the very fastest Amtrak trains take only 19 hours and 32 minutes. But the China's trains, normal trains, to Shanghai, Beijing, take 4 hours and 18 minutes. What a contrast in terms of the effectiveness of Chinese rail infrastructure relative to the US. Here's another example on supercomputers. So of the 500 fastest supercomputers in the world in June of this year, China had 173 out of the 500. The US had 128, Japan had 33, and then, so this was first, second, and third, and then, for example, the UK was down in 7th place with 12 of these 500 of the 500 fastest supercomputers. So China's way ahead in terms of the number of supercomputers, fastest supercomputers. Let me go on now to cyber Cold War. So it is said that software is eating the world, which is closely linked up with the point that I made earlier, that semiconductors are the new oil of the 21st century. These two things go together. Software is eating the world. But software makes users vulnerable to hackers. And I'm going to skip most of this. I'm going to skip this paragraph. I'll come back to that in a second. It has been said that there are 2 kinds of companies and government agents: those who know they have been hacked, and those who have been hacked but don't know they have been hacked. Everybody has been hacked. Just as an example, Chinese hackers hacked Google in 2009, and they had a specific goal to get Google's source code so they could get reliable access to any Gmail account, and especially to Chinese dissidents' Gmail's accounts. I've drawn on this book by Nicole Perlroth. This is how they tell me the world will end. Nicole Perlroth was the New York Times cyber correspondent, and she has written a book about cyber war. And she explains how sophisticated hackers want to get hold of the source code, which is the raw matter for software and hardware, which tells your devices and your apps how to behave. And the long game of sophisticated hackers is to manipulate the source code. What they do is to look for holes or make holes in the source code. Think of these holes as analogous to an invisible hole in the wall of the Oval Office in the White House, an invisible hole in the wall through which hackers, enemies, can find out what's going on inside the Oval Office. And so they use these holes to cause damage or get bribes or gain secret information immediately or years in the future. They may simply sit on the hole, their knowledge of the hole, for years until a good opportunity arises for them to benefit from exploiting the hole, provided, of course, the holes are not fixed in the meantime. They target widely used software like Windows or Apple's software. The holes are known as 0 days. 0 days. Just where this name comes from, I don't know. It's a code word. So when the hackers are talking about holes, they use the phrase 0 days. And there is a market for 0 days with sellers, with brokers, with buyers. The buyers include spy agencies, the FBI, the CIA, MI6, and perhaps the Brazilian equivalent. The prices paid per 0 day, that is per hole, may cost $2 million and more just to buy knowledge of one particular hole. And of course, one of the great problems is that the Internet of Things, which is this great new glorious technology wave that's coming, the Internet of Things provides a wide attack surface for these hackers. The US is the offensive cyber superpower. I mean, people recognize that the US is dominant in attack using these cyber weapons, but it's also the most attacked. Unfriendly states like Iran, Korea, North Korea, sorry, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, know that they cannot match the US militarily, but they can use cyber weapons cheaply to attack and defend themselves. And they can buy these cyber weapons in the form of buying 0 days, buying knowledge of the holes in the software that the US uses. And so Chinese hackers in 2014 hacked into the US Office of Personnel Management, and what they obtained included access to the repository of details of everyone who had applied for a security clearance in the United States, including Chinese dissidents. Then this hack went undiscovered for 1 year. That is, the Chinese had access for 1 year before the hack was discovered and the hole was fixed. In 2014-15, Russian hackers got access to the security systems of the White House, the State Department, the Treasury, and the Department of Homeland Security. Quite amazing. So here is a particular case of Russia's cyber attacks on Ukraine after 2014. 2014, Yanukovych was overthrown, and then a pro-Western government came in. For 5 long years after 2014, the Kremlin's digital army shelled Ukraine with thousands of cyber attacks a day and scanned the country's networks incessantly for signs of weakness. I'm quoting now from Pelroth, such as a weak password, a misplaced zero, pirated and unpatched software, a hastily erected firewall. They looked for anything to sow discord and undermine Ukraine's pro-Western leadership. And then in 2015, they crossed a Rubicon. That is, they routed an attack on Ukraine through compromised servers in Singapore, in the Netherlands, in Romania, and they shut down the Ukrainian power grid for 6 hours just before Christmas. So for 6 hours just before Christmas, Ukrainians in this bitter cold had no form of power, electric power. And then came Russia's cyber attack in 2017. Pelroth quotes Putin saying, a few weeks before the cyber attack, he is quoted as saying, Russian hackers are like artists who wake up in the morning in a good mood and start painting. If they have patriotic leanings, they may try to add their contribution to the fight against those who speak badly about Russia. So this is Putin in a public forum praising Russian hackers. And soon after this, just a few weeks after, Russian hackers shut down Ukraine's government agencies, railways, ATMs, gas stations, postal service, and the radiation monitors at Chernobyl nuclear site. And then this same attack, just within minutes, jumped out of Ukraine and spread far and wide around the world. It shut down a Cadbury chocolate factory in Tasmania. It disrupted operations at FedEx. It halted operations at Maersk, the great shipping conglomerate. So the point is, this attack on Ukraine got way out of control. The Russians were no longer in control. Again, it just illustrates the huge dangers that we are under in not being very, very careful with our critical infrastructure, water treatment plants, for example, that are online, that are using software, that is to say, are not controlled by analog technology. Hackers can get into a water treatment plant, to the chemical control part of the water treatment plant, and release all kinds of chemicals into the water supply. So this is just to illustrate the danger. Russia's cyber attack on Ukraine 2017 coincided with Ukraine's National Independence Day, and that was no accident, as you can guess. Russia was sending a message to Ukraine: you are not independent. And this was 2017, not February 2022. So let me say something about the underlying politics of this new Cold War, beginning with China. A recent RAND Corporation study found that the single most important quality of a society that makes for national competitive success is this: driving national ambition. Well, as I illustrated yesterday, China was a major civilization till the early 19th century. Then came the century and a half of humiliation at the hands of the West. And since 1980, China has been on a relentless quest to recover its previous status and self-esteem. And it scores very high on driving national ambition. And so, too, of course, do Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, much more so, for example, than the Philippines or Indonesia or Malaysia. And just to show you again, this is one of the most dramatic charts I've seen in my whole life, and it should be right at the start of any big discussion of development. And it shows, in particular, this dramatic collapse in China's average income from 18, 20, 50% of that of the West to 7% in 1950. And this is this sense of humiliation at the hands of the West has been driving this great project of the Chinese government to get back to the very top table, preferably a G2, the US and China sitting together to determine how things go, and then eventually the G1 with China in and the US out. And so China, to do this, is following a state-led all-of-nation. This phrase is really important. I mean, we know this phrase, state-led, but this is key to China. It's all of the nation. It's not just state-led. It's all of the nation. Everybody, individuals, so-called private organizations, state agencies, all united in this great national project. The economy is capitalist, but of course it's much more penetrated by the state and by the Chinese Communist Party than Western states. And it gives China huge advantages in entering sectors on the tech frontier and coordinating domestic investment strategy with international influence strategy with espionage strategy. And in particular, China is making a huge push to build what are called infrastructure alliances. It has few military alliances. It has only one overseas military base. But instead, it has built a dense network of infrastructure alliances, especially via this program called the Belt Road Initiative, the BRI. The BRI has probably committed about 1.9, almost $2 trillion across 1,600 projects, infrastructure projects, since it started in 2013. For example, in 2020, it spent $61 billion for these projects. 2021, $60 billion. This is the biggest infrastructure investment project in history. It's absolutely huge. And what happens is that recipient governments in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in coming into Western Europe, such as Greece, take out loans from Chinese banks, and Chinese companies build the infrastructure. The projects are everywhere in the global south, and as I just mentioned, also in the periphery of Europe, in Greece, for example, but also in East and Central Europe. The US remains the hegemonic power in the world. Many commentators exaggerate US decline and China's rise. We can think of a state's structural power, this is the phrase, structural power, as measured by its population size times average income. And by that measure, US's structural power is about 1.5 times greater than China. Of course, US structural power is much reinforced by the dollar. 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are in dollars, and even more important than that, the US government controls the world's dollar payment system, such as SWIFT, and is able to impose draconian sanctions on, for example, Russia, through its control of the world's dollar payment system. Also, the US remains preeminent in science and technology. Think, for example, of the recent launching of the Webb telescope. Another indicator, US firms had the highest share of global profits in 18 out of 25 sectors. For example, sectors like heavy machinery, electronics, aerospace, pharma, media. In 18 out of these 25 sectors, the US firms had the highest share of global profits in those sectors in both 2006 and 2017. And the US demonstrates its continuing hegemony in its ability to organize a coalition, especially of European countries, to defenestrate, that is, to throw out the window, the world's largest nuclear power, and also a G20 member and a former member of the G8 from global capitalism. This is what the US has succeeded in doing, expelling Russia from global capitalism after Russia's invasion. So there's an interesting question. We know that the US is in a highly polarized state. The US is flying apart domestically. And the question is, how can such a fractious nation continue to lead the West? Well, the answer is one cannot presume that domestic chaos must lead to external weakness. These are two separate things. They can be, at least to some considerable extent, separated. The US has been polarizing for decades, and yet it leads the West's response to Ukraine. Germany, on the other hand, is the most cohesive, the least polarized of the major democracies. It certainly does not lead the West's response to Ukraine. Also, remember that the US needs an existential enemy to solidify its leadership of the fractious Western alliance. I remember in 1989, Georgy Labatov, no, is that right? Labatov? Who was the head of the Institute for the Study of the United States, or something like that, in Moscow, and who was a close advisor to 5 general secretaries of the Communist Party. He said to a visiting delegation of American politicians, "We are about to do you a disservice. We are going to deprive you of an external enemy. We are going to deprive you of, yes, he didn't say external. We're going to deprive you of an enemy. And that's my point. The US needs an existential enemy to solidify its leadership of the fractious Western alliance, despite Western electorates losing support for global leadership activities. And then you have to remember that the US Constitution makes a clear separation between domestic politics or low politics and foreign or high politics. And that separation gives space for US geopolitical elites to continue to lead against China. But then comes the question, what about Trumpism? Let's say Trump is re-elected in 2024. What will happen to the US, the US international activities generally, and specifically on China? Let me elaborate a bit on the US and the G7 response to China's BRI. So in 2021, the general point is that the US is extremely worried about the BRI, panicky. So in 2021, Biden announced a plan called the Build Back Better World, and it was called the B3 World because there are 3 Bs here, the Build Back Better World, which pledged to catalyze hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure investment. And the G7 summit in 2021 pledged to support this B3W. After 1 year, nothing had happened. No funds, public or private, had been pledged. And so B3W sank without trace. So for the next G7 summit, just a couple of months ago, Biden proposed what he called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, initials PGII, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And this plan was to involve $600 billion in public and private funds for infrastructure investments in developing countries over 5 years. This was the US-led response to the BRI, which has been going since 2013, and it's taken until now for anything even plausible to be mounted on the part of the West. But, the plan was described as offering value-driven, high-quality, sustainable infrastructure. These words are an implicit criticism of China's BRI. And also the White House asserts that this program will enhance US national security. But again, the question is, what will happen? Will this too sink without trace? My guess is that not very much will happen in response to this, but that is just a guess. But even if 600 billion are mobilized, and remember, this is not just public, this has to include private, mega contributions from private firms as well. 600 billion is less than a third of China's BRI spending over this period. I think my time is up. I'm just going to highlight a couple of headlines from the propaganda Cold War. And my point is that the US has been mounting a great campaign to discredit the BRI by saying that this is a program for debt trap diplomacy. US officials travel the global south to warn against China's debt trap diplomacy, especially through BRI projects. So what happens? They land at airports built by China. They travel to the capital city by road or rail built by China. They go to the central buildings built by China, and they say, don't get into bed with China because you will get into a debt trap. Basically what has happened is that the State Department has commissioned various scholars to write reports explaining the debt trap strategy, but without reference to the State Department commissioning these studies. That is, in the main such study, it was done by people connected with the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, with no reference to the State Department commissioning the study. And independent studies have cast a lot of doubt on this this argument that China is pursuing debt trap diplomacy. And let's see, in a minute I will give you a list of references to these independent studies, but I also have to say that China is now scaling back the BRI because of, one, a big fall in China's foreign exchange reserves, and two, a big increase in bad loans. So there really has been a big increase in bad loans on BRI projects. So in terms of foreign exchange reserves, China's peaked at 4 trillion in 2014. They're now 3 trillion. And that gives Chinese financial firms less hard currency to lend to BRI countries. That's one reason why China is cutting back. But the other reason is that BRI loans are now turning bad in record numbers, and China is having to renegotiate many. It's being forced to realize that in many cases the problem is not insufficient liquidity, the problem is insolvency. And so China is now facing its first overseas debt crisis. And this BRI debt problem is just part of a wider debt crisis facing many developing countries. And so one interesting question then is, will China participate in multilateral debt renegotiations with BRI countries? For example, will China participate in the Paris Club for debt renegotiations on a multilateral basis? We'll see. That'll be an interesting question to watch. Here are some references to evidence on the debt trap diplomacy argument. Okay, so I think my main conclusion is, I'll finish on this note. If developing countries such as Brazil, India, can balance China and the West and remain on good terms with both Beijing and Western capitals, then they stand to reap big rewards in a way that would not be the case if there was not this Cold War competition between China and the West. I'll end on that note. Thank you.
We can open for questions. I just want to say that, Professor, I was going to ask you that, the last point. What was the benefit that developing countries could gain from this multipolar system? And you concluded in this way. I think it was a great presentation.
Ele vai responder a sua primeiro ou não? Okay, Professor Wade, very, very interesting and very, we that depend very hardly on this fight over and over again between the two commanding poles of the world. First question, 2 or 3 weeks ago, The Economist puts on the cover, the new oil is data control. 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this is, for me, maybe more important than chips control, as you said in your lecture. And second question, straight, when you see about the fractured U.S. internal politics, you did not comment about China. What China, I had the opportunity to be in China for the last 6 years for 2 times. My son was working there. And I could see that they are increasing 3 to 40 million people a year from poverty, and they are really doing hard on that. Not only tracks, they are doing a lot of work, a lot of new factories, but even in spite of that, there are a lot of upheavals in very part to Uyghurs in one problem, different other problems, and if Xi Jinping is able to control these problems, probably they will succeed. But I'm not positive that he will be able to keep hard hands to control those upheavals, because if he does, China probably within 10 years will be, I mean, I just would like to hear your comments on that, please.
Sorry, comments on what?
On what? If you agree that if China is able to control the upheavals, that probably
The upheavals.
Yes, because they are really increasing people from poverty to middle level for the last 10 years, and they are doing every year. They have a target, and they do it. I was able to see that in China. But on the other hand, the upheavals are very strong. I would like to hear some comments, because you comment about the U.S. problems, internal problems, but you didn't mention China internal problems. Because for me, this is a very, very important point. State capitalism, or how do you name it, commanding capitalism. Right now, you see that HSBC was obliged to put people from the Communist Party on the board. I don't know if you heard it. This is last week comment. And China is being able to do that. It's a very different type of capitalism. But they are doing. And if Xi Jinping is able to keep doing that, probably China will, at some point, will be even stronger than today. I don't know if you agree with that.
Basically, yes, because there's very limited scope for the mass of the population to mobilize against the government, because the control apparatus is so pervasive. I was astonished to read that just fairly recently, one city in southern China, but perhaps many more than just this one city, had installed facial recognition technology for the toilet paper dispensers in public toilets, so that if you wanted to go and use a public toilet, your face would be subject to this technology, and if you were not recognized, if you had a low citizenship score, like if you had a criminal record or something, then the toilet paper dispenser would not give you toilet paper. And I thought this was just so astonishing as an illustration of the pervasiveness of high-tech control devices. But in this particular city had come to the attention of a New York Times reporter. Why? Because there was a popular protest about having this facial recognition technology on toilet paper dispensers. And so in response to the popular protest, the local government did remove the facial recognition technology. But can you just imagine that? Living in a society where social control is so pervasive, so intense at every point in your life, even you using a public toilet, that the scope for protest is really quite limited. And another example would be the response to the lockdowns in Shanghai and in other cities. I mean, really draconian lockdowns. And there was some protest, but it didn't amount to anything. So the control system is very, very powerful. And you mentioned HSBC being forced to put members of the Communist Party on its board. Well, in all organizations of any size, the number two, not the number one, but the number two, will be a Communist Party member. And power in the organization may well rest with the number two, not with the number one. Number one will be the public face, but the number two is the one that has the power and will be a Communist Party member. I've been to well-known in the West research organizations, economic research organizations. I can't immediately think of their names, but in Beijing. And that was the case in those economic research organizations. The number two was a Communist Party member. So, you know, the sort of really simplistic theory of China's economic development is China develops when there's not a civil war. China does not develop when there is a civil war. But no civil war, China develops. And I was very struck by seeing a ranking of countries. This is a ranking done by Forbes, or at least published by Forbes magazine just a couple of months ago. A ranking of countries in the world by school scores, school test scores, standardized school tests, number one, and number two by IQ, average IQ. And if you take the top 7 countries on both measures, well, China is in both, but 6 of the top 7 countries on both measures are in Northeast Asia. That is, if you take Singapore into Northeast Asia. 6 of the top 7 are in Northeast Asia. So they have this combination of very, very high-performing population on average, together with controls which keep that population within very narrow boundaries. And so I think that basically you're right. For the next several decades, China will continue to grow pretty fast, even though its growth has come down a lot, but it still will continue to grow faster than Western countries. You mentioned also that The Economist front page, or rather front cover, talked of the data. What is the phrase, data?
As new oil.
Yeah, data as new oil. Yeah.
2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. So I see data and semiconductors as intimately linked. You can't really have data without the semiconductors. And so the two things are essentially go together. Data is the new oil, but always remember, data is subject to hacking. And so I come back, just to finalize this comment, to the point that we have to really seriously think of taking critical infrastructure, such as nuclear plants, such as water treatment plants, and you can go on, taking critical infrastructure off the internet, so and putting it under analog controls, making what is called an air gap, a gap in the air, so that hackers cannot get access to those the software of the critical infrastructure. But there's very little attention being given to this problem, and I think that that's going to be really a major problem facing us as the Internet of Things continues to expand. Cyber war will become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Damien.
There has been some say, newspaper analysis saying that the economic sanctions against Russia has, in fact, pushed Russia to the Chinese.
Yes.
So in a way, it was a backfire in terms of the long-term dispute between the U.S. and China.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also another aspect, which is the fact that while the U.S. and some of Western countries have implemented other economic sanctions, like against Cuba or Venezuela or Vietnam, that really didn't matter for global economy. There was no impact. But now we see that we have a new surge in inflation in Europe and in the U.S. We have a refugees crisis in Europe. We have energy insecurity in Europe. So it's quite different from other economic or previous economic sanctions. And on top of that, it looks more like the old colonialist or imperialist disputes than a real survival challenge, because, well, it's not Soviet Union anymore. There was no you say you can dislike Putin, but it's not a different regime. American companies were there. It's a capitalist economy, right?
Including
so McDonald's and all those symbols, yes. So a question that one might make is, was it an error? Was it, say, a military greedy push for continuing to weaken other countries and to reinforce an already very well-established military hegemony of the US, which in the end might have caused more damage to the Western world than favorable outcomes for mainly the Western population. The military, of course, they are happy. The military industry is happy, but I mean, regarding the population of Europe and the US, are they better off with this trap, I guess you mentioned in another article, of pushing Russia to the point of invading Ukraine and then making economic sanctions?
Yeah. I really don't know how to assess that. It is certainly the case that Russia and China have become closer. But I also think that China is probably giving a lot less material support, like military equipment, to Russia's war than the kind of the Western rhetoric suggests that it is. That's point number one. But point number two is China does not want Russia to be defeated. And why? Because China fears being isolated without having a viable Russia by its side, being isolated and becoming vulnerable without Russia by its side, becoming vulnerable to what Beijing sees as strategic aggression of the US-led West. So China does not want Russia to be defeated, but it's probably giving less material support to Russia than the rhetoric suggests. And I do think that that Washington has to steer away from this talk of containing China and give more emphasis to engaging with China, treating China as a competitor, but not as an enemy. That's the way by which this whole thing has to be kind of calmed down. But as for whether the US made a strategic mistake in encouraging the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I've made a separate argument, you referred to it, I have made the argument and I provided evidence that the US did have the intention of encouraging Russia to invade Ukraine precisely in order to get Russia into the quagmire or the bog or the trap that the US was in Vietnam, which so weakened the US internally, but also the trap that the Russian army was in Afghanistan in the 1990s, in the 1980s. And US strategists consider that the failure of the Russian army in Afghanistan, and remember it was there for 10 years, completely bogged down, but the failure of the army led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So from the American standpoint, it was a great success that the Americans gave lots of munitions, lots of armaments to bin Laden and the other mujahideen in fighting against the pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan. The Americans gave them lots of munitions, which then attracted the Soviet army in to defend the Soviet government, the Soviet favoring government in Afghanistan. And that trapped the army, the Soviet army, into this quagmire, this bog, for 10 years, which really undercut the strength of the Soviet Union. And so, just to repeat, the Americans considered that a great tactical success, and they were looking for a similar success by getting Russia trapped in Ukraine. This is a narrative, this is a story completely different from what is in the Western media, like in the New York Times and the Financial Times and the Guardian and so on and so on. But I think there's quite a lot of evidence for it. But then there remains the question that Damien raised. Will this in the end lead to a more stable world, a more prosperous United States, and so on? And I really have very little way to assess that. I don't know if any of you do. Somebody in this room is giving a paper later today, which I think, from the title, basically disagrees with the line of argument that I've been making. Is that person? Oh, that's you. Okay. So can I just check, when are you giving that paper?
Now, in the next session at 10:10.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Or 11. I don't know exactly the hour.
Okay. Okay.
We can make him the first one to speak, so we can.
Do you want to comment on the argument that I've made just before your speech?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And, well, I will make a question, so better than I presented my argument now. I would like to question about the utility and adequacy of the use of the Cold War analogy. I mean, I do agree with you that there is a growing systemic rivalry between China and the United States. But I don't know, or I'm not convinced that the Cold War analogy is the best way for describing it. Because the context today and the history of Sino-American relations are so different than the context of the 50s. I would like to point to two facts. One of the facts is that globalization. China is winning the game in the rules of globalization. And it's quite interesting when you say that the building of WTO is dedicated to a neoliberal guy. This is quite interesting, and China is winning the game playing these rules. So China is incorporated in the global world order. This is quite different from the Soviet Union. Yeah. And the second point is that China and the United States are quite interdependent in economic terms. Okay, there is a lot of disputes, technological, commercial, the trade war, but they are quite integrated. And the United States is quite dependent from this integration. Yeah. I think yesterday or today there is something in the newspapers that says that Biden is considering put out some of the restrictions to China to deal with the inflation, because China products are cheaper. And in a context of stagnation of wages in the United States, access to China cheaper products is a solution, it's not a problem. In the same time, there is a growing perception in the United States that United States is a net loser of globalization and China is a threat. So my point here is not about my point here is a conceptual one, that maybe the concept or the category of World War 2.0 is not a good one for describing what has happened today. So this is the argument and my point of view of the things.
Okay, just let me remind you, though, I did say that there were some important similarities today with the first Cold War, but I also made quite a lot of emphasis on the differences between the first Cold War and what I call the second Cold War. So you can have this word, this phrase, Cold War, applying to quite significantly different situations, even as you recognize some similarities. We better break. Shall we break?
Can we have one last?
Oh, right, yes.
No, it's very simple and follows a little what Alexandre said. My question is, you speak about the second Cold War. Okay. In this second Cold War, the United States is waging a war against China. It's not, China is responding, for sure. You showed very clearly this. But the war is made by the United States. The initiative is of the United States. And they argue that they must stop the growth of China. Very, very clearly. Very, well, this kind of behavior, the justification, the legitimation, the ideological legitimation of this is much different from the one that the United States made with Soviet Union. Because at that time, Soviet Union was not waging a war, a military war or something like that, but it was trying to change the economic system to communism. And this was really a threat not only to the United States, but a threat to the whole capitalist world, to the capitalists in Brazil, for instance, or in France or in England. Not this time, no. China is not making an attack on capitalism, not making so. So I think that this, well, my question is, don't you think that the United States will lose this war for a lack of a good argument? This is my, in the ideological point. Lose, you don't have the support of the other countries that it expects for this.
Well, the problem is that China's whole system is based on intense control of populations. And the US and the West's legitimation for their system being superior has a lot to do with notions of freedom, of liberty, freedom of expression, for example. And those are very powerful values. So the Chinese system really does require a very, very strong, effective state. And in most of the world, including in developing countries, that effective state is not there. And states can legitimize themselves much more easily in developing countries by talking of freedom, freedom of expression, and so on and so on. So I don't think that the fact that China over the next decades will become economically more and more powerful means that the US and the West will sort of lose the ideological advantage in the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we cannot open for Masterclass. We are going to have 15 minutes coffee, and then we start the sessions for paper presentation. So we're going to start 15 minutes later the presentation of the papers, okay? Thank you.